Today we are going to be talking about Black Lives Matter, the organization, right, and what they've been accused of. I want to give a little bit of explanation of what this segment is, and it's something new that I'm introducing to my channel, and it's something that I am going to do more consistently. And so, you know, a lot of times nonprofits end up in the news due to scandals and fraud, you know, misappropriation of assets. And I want to start diving into some of those and talking a lot more about what these organizations could have done better to prevent these things. And so the Black Lives Matter, you know, organizer Patrisse Cullors was accused, you know, of stealing millions in funds, right? She ended up resigning, and I want to talk through that a little bit. And so, because I don't want to get the facts wrong, I do have notes on this one that I'm going to be referencing. So let's get started. Again, we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and I want to be very clear that there is a difference between the organization and the movement. Now, the organization was born out of the movement, but it is not one and the same. And per what I tend to see on social media, I think people think that it's one and the same, and that also, I think, is cause for a lot of the confusion that we end up seeing, right? And so this story has been in the news in more ways than one. She is not the only leader of the organization that has been accused of stealing funds, but we're going to be talking a little bit more about her specifically, right? And so, long story short, Patrisse Cullors and other leaders in the organization were accused of financial improprieties, right? And so, you know, people are claiming that millions of dollars in donations were misused. Not necessarily stolen, right, but misused. One of the things to note is that the organization did grow very fast. A huge part, I believe, of what was happening was that the organization grew way quicker than they had the ability to grab the reins and manage. That really could also cause a misuse of funds. And sometimes not even meant that funds had been stealing or misappropriated, but sometimes that you just maybe either overspent on certain things, you weren't tracking what you were spent on. And by definition, that also, right, is considered misuse, I will say. But it grew very fast in the wake of George Floyd's death, right? And so many people were in the streets angry, calling for change, calling for reform, and rightfully so. However, you know, Black Lives Matters, the movement was at the forefront of this. That is what kind of propelled the organization. So many people were donating, giving money, right? We talk about individuals, donors, we're talking about organizations, corporations, right? Because of course, during this time also, so many corporations and people were being called out for either their lack of support of the Black community, their lack of support in, you know, police brutality. And so I honestly feel like a lot of people wanted to give money or throw money at the cause, and naturally, right, Black Lives Matter, who people, one, don't know that there's a difference between the movement and the organization, a lot of their funds were sent to the organization. Now, specifically, there was a lot of criticism around the foundation paying $6 million for a Los Angeles compound in 2020. The property had 6 bedrooms and bathrooms, a swimming pool, a sound stage, an office space, but it was meant to be both a meeting venue and a campus for Black artists. One of the things that I read that Patrisse Cullors said was that so many Black organizations don't own things, right? Don't own property. And what I will say is I've worked for enough organizations to say that I do kind of believe that. And the organizations that I've worked for that have not been, you know, either Black or minority led, they've owned property. And I'm not just talking about one building. You know what I mean? Like they've owned, you know, multiple properties. And so property management was a significant part of the business. It sounds like she was trying to lean into that, but many people didn't understand why like a home would be purchased, you know, as far as the property. And so I get the confusion. I get the side eye, you know what I mean? But this is also where, and I'll get into that a little bit later, where checks and balances comes into play, right? Like the board, being able to document your decisions and the thought process around why you do certain things. And this goes back to lack of infrastructure. The next piece is what I believe really blew things up was when the organization announced a $90 million fundraising haul, right? So this announcement specifically drew a lot of criticism, not only from just the public, but also individual chapters. And this is also an important thing to note because some organizations that have chapters, they are not actually affiliated. And from what I could find, there seemed to be a lot of gray area around like, are local chapters actually a part of the actual national organization? And again, that goes back to infrastructure. Like, how are these things governed? How are they set up? And so here you have the main organization saying, oh, we raised $90 million, but then you have individual chapters in different states saying, well, why haven't we seen any of these funds, right? And so they were calling for a lot more transparency. They wanted to know what was happening with all of these dollars that you are reporting that you've received. And so finally, I will, before I get into more so my take and like some best practices, Patrice did note that the foundation was slow to build the necessary groundwork and infrastructure. And she believes that that was also the cause of a lot of the chaos. And I absolutely do agree with that. So my personal take is, I do believe that some mistakes really were made around infrastructure, internal controls, segregation of duties, and transparency. But what I didn't like was the public's willingness to really jump to conclusions because the Black Lives Matter nonprofit organization was led by a Black woman. And so there was the combing through her finances, there was the combing through all of her purchases. Like, it was crazy. And I felt like instead of criticizing the organization as a whole, it really was crucifying her personally, when we know that it takes more than one person to run an organization. You're not making these decisions by yourself. And so I just feel like, let's just say, you know, there were improprieties and things were happening. We want to be careful to hold the organization itself accountable. And when I say the organization, not the entity itself, right? But there are multiple leaders. There is a board that is supposed to be governing leadership. They're supposed to be governing the organization, but so many of the headlines were about her specifically, her purchases. And there was no concrete evidence tying what she was doing personally to the funds that were brought into the organization. And I think that's also an important thing to point out. In fact, when they did release the report where they were detailing like that $90 million, it showed that she didn't make a salary. And what I will say is that is very common. And what I don't like about the nonprofit space is that there is this notion that you are supposed to do this hard, gruesome, tiresome work for little to no pay. Like, you should just be grateful to be in this space. And that is not the case. This is really, really hard work. And if nonprofit organizations didn't exist, we'd be in trouble because there are not a lot of people, there are not a lot of businesses or corporations outside of nonprofits that are doing this work. And so we need organizations that are willing to go into the communities, support some of the world's, hardest, biggest, roughest challenges. And that's why transparency is important, right? That's why internal controls and governance is important, right? Because you are dealing with other people's funds that you're supposed to be putting towards a cause. But I think we have to be very careful with this notion that if you work in the nonprofit space, you just shouldn't be paid. And so I did want to point out that it did say she didn't receive a salary. People were taking pictures of her home, posting it online. Like, it's also like a safety issue. Like, I just really didn't like that piece. I think we have to really rebrand the nonprofit space. Like, if anything, some of these nonprofit executive directors should be making six figures. Like, and we have to think, like, not every organization is grassroots. Some of you don't even know, like, that some of the biggest organizations in the world are nonprofits, like AARP, right? And if you think, I know that CEO, ain't making no little salary. And naturally, right, the salary has to be reasonable. But what I'm saying is that typically when financials are released, there's always a lot of outrage as to, like, what are people making when to do this work, you need a livable wage as well, right? Like, these leaders are doing a lot, and most times a lot of what they're doing, they are not paid for. And so we have to be very careful with this notion that they don't deserve to be well paid, because that also stops people from entering into the industry. Because that was almost what stopped me. When I heard nonprofit, it was like, they don't pay good. They can't afford me, and that's not the case. And so that really wasn't the case. Here's some best practices that really could have helped to mitigate some of this. One, a strong board with a finance committee. Now, every organization should have a board. But what I will say is that some smaller organizations, typically just because they're so small, and so by nature the board is small, they usually are not broken up into committees. But if you look at larger organizations, not only do they have a board, they also have committees. And one of those committees is the finance committee. And Black Lives Matter was large enough that they needed a stronger board. They also needed a finance committee that was doing their job. And that takes me into the second point of annual audits. So typically it's the job of the finance committee to, put out the RFPs for the auditor and to lead the charge essentially. Well, because the audit chair sits on the finance committee, right? And so that audit chair is ensuring that the organization is being audited, that the auditors are vetted because scandal, right? We know. And making sure that those results are public, but also when you get audited and material weaknesses or significant deficiencies are found, making sure that you then go back to management to actually implement the things needed to plug those holes. Too many organizations just move on from the audit like ain't nothing happened and just go back to business as usual. And that's what often gets them caught up. And so I believe that if the board was stronger, had a greater presence, which then would have translated to a strong, that strong finance committee, the audit chair being more vocal, like that also would have helped to mitigate a lot of this, because then you should have been able to clearly show me and break down where funds came from, where it was spent, who it was spent on, what it was spent on, right? Because that is also what helps to ease the public's mind. And that is also where transparency comes into play. You have to be transparent about where funds are going. And the best way to be transparent is to your financials. And having your financials audited is an additional stamp, which goes towards like, oh, okay, they're doing what they say they're doing. So the next piece, which is a part of that I feel like I'm just going in, is then releasing those financials, right? You have the websites where you become a member, your organization becomes a member, you post your financials or your audited financials. Some even do it on their website where they're providing annual reports that kind of not only talk about like how much money they raised and where they spent it, but like the impact that they had. I think if people were able to easily tie back how much money the organization brought in and what they've done as far as, giving back to the community, there would have been less outrage. And this is kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, but because so many people also tied the organization to the movement, I just think that there was a higher expectation of those funds being spent towards the advancement of the movement, if that makes sense. And because they are two separate things, that really wasn't happening. And so even that, like educating on, this is what we do over here, this is how we support the community, this is how we support the movement, but also making it clear, like, we are not one and the same, because that's also where a lot of the confusion came from. Policies and procedures. How are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? Is there a fiscal manual? Like, what are you using to govern the organization, specifically the accounting piece, right? Because we're talking about the money management. If I'm an auditor and I come in, one of the first things I want to look at is your policies and procedures, because that tells me, or it's supposed to tell me how you guys function as it relates to the accounting, how you are managing those. Then coupled with the organization's bylaws, right? And these things not being some document that you just create and put on a shelf somewhere, but these things that you create and you actually follow, you actually review, you actually update, and making sure you have the right people in place. An organization that big, right? I would hope, would have an accounting team with separate roles and responsibilities and people responsible for certain areas of the accounting function. And when you think about what she said about the organization growing so fast, a lot of times when that happens, they don't press pause, right? To really let the back-end operations catch up to how quickly the organization is moving. And then what ends up happening is that you continue to move fast, but then your operations continue to lag behind. But then that's how you get into trouble with when someone starts to question, well, how did you manage that? How did you come to that decision? There's no documentation. There's nothing for us to refer to. You know what I mean? And so you have to be very mindful. And so I do say all that to say that I was really sad, because having such negative news around BLM tarnishes the movement and what it was intended to stand for, right? But I think it's also a lesson that you have to have your ducks in a row, and that it's not enough to just bring in money. We can't just be focused on let's raise, let's apply for these grants, let's go get this money, and then not have a plan for how it's going to be managed. Your financial infrastructure, your financial operations are just as important, because you have to be able to be transparent about what's happening with the management of those funds. And so many organizations stop at let's bring in the money and don't think about that second part, right? So let this be a lesson that as much as you pay attention and you plan to fundraise, apply for grants, work really hard to bring in funds, you need to work equally as hard to make sure that you have a plan and a process for how you are going to manage said funds and maintain a level of transparency, so that you are not questioned about where funds are going, where they're coming from, how they're being spent, because that would be built into your process. So I hope that this was helpful. I plan to do these more often, going to really be dissecting some stories that come up in the news, some of the things that have been, really prevalent in regards to like scandals in the nonprofit space, because this is a space that is really important. And so I want to bring more, attention to the things that organizations need to have in place in order to operate better. So hope you like this video. If there are any scandals that you'd like me to dive into or talk about more, please drop them below and we can talk about it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.